benchmarking fractions. When we think about benchmarking fractions, we should be thinking about close to 0, close to a half, or close to a whole. So, when we look at this fraction, 1/3, is it closest to 0? Is it closest to a whole? Or is it close to about a half? When we look at that picture, we can see that it's closer to this halfway point. Plus, when we think about thirds, if we think of half of 3, we get 1 1/2. 1/3 is closer to 1 1/2 thirds than it is to 0 thirds. Let's look at this fraction right here, 1/5. When we think about fifths, if we only have this one piece colored in, are we closer to 0 at this end? Are we closer to the halfway point? Or are we closer to the whole? When we look at the picture, we can see it's closer to 0. Plus, we know that half of 5 is 2 1/2, and we only have 1. 1 is closer to 0 fifths than it is to 2 1/2 fifths. So 1/5 is closer to 0. Here's 3/5. When we think about 3/5, we can look at the picture and see that it falls right around this halfway point. It's closer to a half. Plus, we know that 3 is close to 2 1/2. Half of 5 is 2 1/2. So 3/5 is just a little bit more than a half. Then we look at this picture. It's 4/5. When we look at this picture, does it seem closest to 0, closest to the halfway point, or closest to the whole? When we look at it, we can see that 4/5 is only 1/5 away from the whole. It's closest to a whole. And then we look at 3/6. When we look at 3/6, is it closest to 0, closest to a whole, or closest to half? We see that it's at the halfway point. 3 is half of 6. Then we move on to looking at in fractions, using the same rules that we were just thinking about. Let's think about twelfths. We have this fraction right here, 1/12. Well, if we only have 1 out of 12, we know that we only have one small piece, so it's got to be close to 0. Now let's think about 5/12. When we're thinking about 5/12, well, what is half of 12? Half of 12 is 6. We know that 5 is just a little bit less than 6. So 5/12 has to be a little bit less than a half, but still very close to the half. Then we can think about 11/12. If we're thinking about 11/12, it's bigger than 6, so it's more than a half. 11 out of 12 means we're only missing one piece. That brings us very close to the whole. Let's look at some of the other fractions. Let's look at sixths. If we have 1/6, we know that 1/6 is only a tiny piece. So that means that it has to be close to 0. It's only 1 out of 6 pieces. Now we can look over here at this one, 5/6. If we have 5 out of 6 pieces, half of 6 is 3, so it's more than a half. Is it closer to that half, or is it closer to whole? Well, if we have 5 out of 6, that means we're only missing one piece. That brings us close to a whole. And then the other 6 that we have is 3/6. When we think of half of 6, we see 3. Oh, so 3/6 is a half. We put it right here. It's obviously close to a half if it is a half. Let's think about fifths next. We have 2/5. Well, thinking back to our pictures earlier, we know that half of 5 is 2 1/2. Well, this is 2/5, so that brings it very close to a half. Let's think about 6/5. Well, we know 5/5 is a whole. 6/5 makes us just a little bit more than a whole. That means we are close to the whole, or close to 1. Let's look at thirds. We know that half of 3 is 1 1/2. So if we have 2/3, we're just a little bit more than a half. And if we have 1/3, we're just a little bit less than a half. And then our last one is tenths. If we know that half of 10 is 5, So 5/10 is a half. Well, we know that 2/10 is less than that. And if we think about being closer to 0 or closer to half, 2/10 is closer to 0/10 than it is to 5/10. So it is closer to 0.